Hello lovely people, welcome to another episode of Book Chat, the regular roundup of stuff I've read at some point in my vague past.
Sophie Vlogs.
I have 3 and a bit books to talk about this week. I'm just going to dive into it, starting with The Letters of Vincent van Gogh. I've been meaning to read this for a while, especially since I went to Amsterdam and I went to the Vincent van Gogh Museum, but this is a collection of the letters, largely the letters that Vincent wrote to his brother Theo. There are also a couple of other letters in here. This was just immensely interesting. I feel like I have a much better understanding of Van Gogh's life. So one thing that I really liked about this particular edition of this is, if I can find, it includes a lot of the, it includes full page or partial excerpts of the actual drawings that he included. So when he sends sketches and stuff to Theo, it does include the sketches. And that was really interesting, especially because Van Gogh, when you think of his portraits, are these oil paintings in colour and stuff like that, but for a lot of his early creation he was working in charcoals and black and white and stuff like that. So it was very interesting to be able to see those drawings, and then that gave me a better understanding of his progression as an artist, because I had seen where he began rather than just like where he ends up here. These letters are very much just like letters, so big swathes of these are about potentially very mundane things. So there's a lot in the early sense about when he wanted to be involved with the church and be a preacher of some kind and stuff like that. There's also a lot of info on like petty squabbles and his disagreements with his family and stuff like that. So I definitely feel like I have a better sense of who Van Gogh was outside of his artwork. He feels to me a little bit like someone who ruminates a lot. Like, there's a number of things in this where he has like unsuccessful love ventures and stuff, and he spends a lot of time in his letters discussing that with Theo, and also like he was in love with his cousin, and he would like turn up to where his cousin lived, and all of her family would be like, she's not here because she saw that you were coming and so she's left. And that to me would be the sign that I should stop turning up. Well, not the sign to him that he should do that. He just kept on doing it. So, like, some of these little episodes I ended up skimming a little bit, because I was like, when he argued with his father and when he had this, the cousin who rejected him said something along the lines of, like, never, no, never. And he keeps referring to it with that phrase, and I was like, if I could never read this phrase again, that would be great. But I don't want that to sound like I didn't enjoy reading these letters, because I did. It was just, he seems like someone who he thinks a lot about stuff. So that also applies to the art. Like, when he's getting into art, he spends a lot of time thinking about, like, when he's trying to do figures, like how to do hands, how to do figures and stuff like that. Equally, it is something that also applied to when he was looking to pursue a career in, like, religion and stuff. Like, he spent a lot of time thinking about religious stuff and his religion and stuff like that, and how other people are religious versus how he is religious, and all of these things. Like, he spends a lot of time thinking about these things and writing about them to Theo. So that was interesting. It's just occasionally I was like, oh, okay, leave the woman alone, she is not interested. It was also interesting to get a better insight into who Theo was, because I knew that Theo was his brother, because I've watched stuff like Loving Vincent and stuff, I understood that. But, like, Theo as an art seller in himself, like, his involvement with the Impressionist movement, stuff like that. Like, it was interesting to get a better sense of who Theo is, even though we don't have Theo's side of the correspondence. But this does have, these are not just like the letters on their own, there's also biographical information given, so it's split into chapters by like physically where he's at, like what location is he, what period, what's going on in between these letters. It has some extracts of what Theo had said, so he'll be like, our person who has curated this will be like, oh, Theo brought up these points, which is what Van Gogh is reacting to in this letter and stuff like that. So that was really helpful. I think largely as well, one of the things that I found most interesting was his development as an artist. Even when he's working in black and white, the way he discusses places he's been and stuff like that, there's always this preoccupation with the colours and stuff like that. Even before he talks about wanting to pursue art, the way he talks about places is through an artistic lens. And as this goes on, and as he becomes increasingly preoccupied with colour and creating things with colour as well, it was so interesting to read that. And it was also so interesting to understand, like with the potato peelers and stuff, which was much darker colour palette than we would think of when we think of him, like in the sunflowers and the yellow and stuff like that. all of the colours in the potato peelers are chosen for a reason, and he talks about how he wants it displayed on a wall that is a particular, like, golden colour and stuff like that, because it's going to bring out the tones that he's included for certain reasons, whereas if you put it on a dark blue wall, they're going to get lost. And all this stuff, like, it's so interesting to get that insight into him and his artistic process and the reasoning behind some of his most famous pictures. That I absolutely loved that. There are some deep moments of sadness in this, you know, like, he's so concerned with the fact that his portraits aren't selling and stuff like that, and there's that thing of, you know, that I know how successful he is regarded now, and I know how big an impact he had on the art world, but he never knew that. And you read these letters and you're like, oh babe, you don't know, but it's gonna be great. It's like, so there was a lot of sadness in here as well, but there was some really beautiful, like, in between some of these very, like, mundane, like, oh, why doesn't father ever understand me, blah blah blah, there were also some really beautiful moments of writing. So this was a really great book, and I'm really glad I read it. The second book I want to talk about is Ka, Stories of the Mind and Gods of India by Roberto Calasso. This is telling stories of the Hindu gods, and I think, if I've got this correct, that a lot of this is retelling stuff that's in the Mahabharata. I haven't read that. I've always meant to read it. It's a text that I really do want to get to. I haven't got there yet, so I'm not 100% sure if that's correct, but at least some of these are from there. I don't know if the rest are from other sources, but this is Roberto Calasso retelling them. I enjoyed this because I know some stuff about Hindu gods, but I'm not super familiar with a lot of it. So it was interesting to learn more, just reading this and that sort of thing. In the first couple of tales, I had a small adjustment because Roberto Calasso sort of gives you no introduction and just throws you in. And some of the text is a little, not disjointed, but he sort of splits it into these big paragraphs that are like different sections. And you'll be getting stuff from, like, one god's perspective, and then you'll go a little bit more like an outsider's look, and then you might be on a different god's perspective, and stuff like that. And so it just meant that as someone who doesn't have a background knowledge of stuff, occasionally in some of the earlier ones, I was like, okay, who are we with? Whose side is this now? And also, because the gods have many names, in different tales, he will use different names for the same god, and sometimes it just took me a little bit to realise which god we were with, and I would be like, oh, we're with this person who is also in this tale, and that sort of thing. So that's potentially just me having less knowledge going into it. But I did enjoy this. It was really interesting. I feel like this has actually made me want to read original texts more, because I think that is the tricky thing with reading a retelling of stuff that you've not read the original of. He might be referencing stuff that I don't really know. So I had an enjoyable time reading this. I think it's made me want to go and read stuff. Like, I have read bits of the Ramayana, but I would like to read, like, more. And as well as telling you the tale, there are bits in each narrative which is sort of him commenting on the tale as it relates to India and stuff like that. There was just, like, I concentrated a lot when I was reading this just to make sure I was following the narrative as we changed perspective, and then also I was also paying attention to when it's Roberto Calasso as, like, or like a narrator figure giving, like, observations on what this tale symbolises and stuff like that, versus, like, the actual story. I don't know, that sounds really confusing, but this occasionally was a confusing text, but I had a good time reading it, and it's made me want to go off and do more further reading. Third book I want to talk about is Cavafy, a critical biography by Robert Liddell. This is a critical biography of C.B. Cavafy. He's a very famous Greek poet. I really like his work, especially his historical poems. I didn't really know a lot about him as a person, so I wanted to read this to get a better sense of that. This was kind of interesting because this biography appears to be responding to an earlier biography, which Robert Liddell clearly thinks did a very poor job and made up stuff and that sort of thing. So there were quite a number of moments in this when he is disparaging what this other person has said, but I don't know what the other person has said. So there were a few moments where I was like, I have no idea what you're responding to right now. Sure, let's just go with it. Whereas this, I've come away with a much better understanding of Van Gogh and sort of the reasoning behind colour decisions and his creativity and art and stuff like that. I don't feel like I've got quite as much of that with this. I understand much more just the events of his life. I don't know if I understand quite as well all of the stuff that's going, why he created certain things and blah blah blah. I don't know. He didn't give me such an insight into him as a creator, but I'm wondering if that's just because like maybe he just didn't have enough evidence for that or stuff. I don't really know. I thought this was perfectly fine. I have a better understanding of the events in Cavafy's life and the life of his family. I didn't feel like I was getting the insights into him as a creator that I did with stuff like this, but maybe that's just because, and there was a note in this as well that is essentially like, the problem with Cavafy is that you just don't have a lot of sources to, it's easy to make stuff up about him because you're just like, you could say, he created this because of this, but you don't actually really know. So, I don't know. I didn't think it was bad. I just like, I didn't get that insight into him that I think I was hoping for. But you know, maybe that's just me. Maybe other people did. Finally, I'm going to briefly mention a book which I DNF'd, and that's Arcadian Nights, Greek Myths Reimagined by John Spurling. This is retellings of stories from Greek mythology. The reason I DNF'd it is because I just didn't really like the voice that it was being told in. It's quite matter of fact. It felt quite blunt. It wasn't very, like, a beautifully written thing. And because I already know the stories, I was just like, you know? And I really wasn't feeling it. And I felt a bit disappointed because I love Greek mythology, I love retellings, blah blah blah. I think that's just not my style of retellings. It was just a bit too, like, blunt and to the point and blah. And I was like, well, I know the story. So, like, why, I don't necessarily need, like, a brutal, realistic, you know, retelling of it. Because I'm like, I know. I don't know. So, I've just decided to DNF it because, you know, lots of books, not enough time, we'll just carry on. That's everything I wanted to talk about this week. As I always say, have you read any of them? Do you have any thoughts on any of them? I'd love to hear any and all of your thoughts in the comments down below. Otherwise, I hope you're having the loveliest of days, and I'll see you next time for something different.